Okay. All right, we're good. All right. Thank you everyone for joining this morning. We're joined today by Crystal Eng, who is an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the U of M Twin Cities. Her research focuses on integrated hydrological modeling to understand how the water cycle interacts with soil, the atmosphere, plants, and biogeochemistry. She is particularly interested in responses to climate change, land use and cover change, and contamination. Recently, she has also been conducting interdisciplinary and community-engaged research through which she strives to demonstrate the need for collaboration with tribes, inclusion of other knowledge systems, and work towards environmental justice. Thank you very much for joining us, Crystal, and I'll pass it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Ben, for the introduction and for the invitation to talk with all of you today. It's a real honor to be here and to be part of this really important effort. So I do have slides, so I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Just give me a shout if anything's not showing up correctly, but yeah, my name is Crystal Eng. Good morning. I'm here to talk with you today about a tribal university collaborative that I'm part of called Kawe, Gidaa-naanaagadawendaamin, Manoomin. In this collaborative, we are focused on Manoomin, which is of course the Ojibwe word for wild rice, or Psiη, which is of course the Dakota word for wild rice. And as I understand earlier in this workshop, maybe on Monday, Mike Dockery, who plays an important role in our collaborative, may have shown you a video clip about this, so you might already be somewhat familiar with the work that we're doing. Now, for full transparency, I do want to say that our collaborative has been funded by the University of Minnesota, the National Science Foundation, the US Geological Survey, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So our collaborative's name was given to us by one of our tribal partners from Fond du Lac, and it's been explained to me that in Ojibwe, it means first we must consider Manoomin, or Psiη. And as this name suggests, our work is centered around wild rice. Now, I don't need to explain to you the profound importance of Manoomin, or Psiη, to many Native people across the region, but it's because of this profound importance that it is so alarming that since Euro-American settlement, Manoomin, or Psiη, has been in decline. In Michigan, it's almost nearly completely disappeared. And here in Minnesota, the situation is not quite so dire, but we have seen declines across the state. And in Canada too, they're seeing decreases in the amount of wild rice they have. And so it's because of these threats to such an important being that our collaborative is trying to understand the biophysical and social aspects that influence wild rice health. Now, by biophysical aspects, I'm talking about environmental factors such as what's going on in the water, the climate, and for social aspects, this is including policies and cultural values around wild rice. Now, even though our work is really centered around Manoomin, or Psiη, really the overarching goal of our work is to support tribal communities and tribal sovereignty. And so because of our prioritization of tribes, we're working closely with a number of tribal partners. So here I'm showing you a list of our formal partners, and by that, I mean that we have signed memorandum of understanding with these tribes, or we have signed letters of support from them. So this list includes Fond du Lac, Mille Lacs, Lac de Flambeau, St. Croix, Minnesota Chippewa Tribe, 1854 Treaty Authority, Gliffwick, or the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and the Great Lakes Intertribal Council. All right, so I do want to say, though, that our work really extends beyond the formal tribal partners as well. And so what you see here is a list of all the members on the collaborative, tribal and university members. And I've highlighted in red here, tribal members are representatives, and they include tribal environmental stewards and harvesters, and Native researchers and Native students. And I want to be able to point out that each of these individuals has explicitly agreed to be listed as a participant in our collaborative. And I have to say that it is a tremendous honor today to be able to speak on behalf of this group. And really, as a non-Native researcher, it's incredibly humbling to be speaking with this audience because nearly everything I've learned about collaborative work has been from working with tribal partners. And so that's why, actually, before going in depth into our collaborative, I think it would be useful for me to explain my own background and how I came to be here talking with you today about our collaborative. And so I think it's useful to provide some of my background because it's really not so different than that of many other researchers here at the U. And so hopefully you'll be able to see just how much I've been able to learn in recent years from working really closely with tribal partners and with Native colleagues and students. So in my early journey here, really my experience working with Manoomin or Psiη with tribal partners only began about 4 years ago. So what kind of background did I come from before that? Well, I'm Chinese American, and here's a family in my photo. And this photo, I think, actually pretty accurately captures how things are in my family. Everything's always a bit chaotic. We're almost always coming around together around food. So my family here, we're ethnically Chinese, but my parents here, you can see here, they came to the US from Malaysia and Taiwan. And even though my older sister, Dawn, and I were born here in the US, we identify really strongly as Chinese immigrant family. And we really try to pass down our traditions to my sister's twin 13-year-old daughters, Nyla and Isis, who are half Dutch. Now, I grew up mostly in Maine, and I have to admit, I learned very little about Native Americans as I was growing up, and this is probably pretty similar to many others in my generation, I think. And so it's really only been recently that I've really begun to realize that I am a settler because my family came here to benefit from this place without acknowledging or compensating the indigenous people here. So that's a bit about my personal and family background. Here's a bit more about my professional training. So I studied math and engineering in school, and I've been trying to apply these skills to study integrated hydrology. And in particular, I'm really driven to understand how climate change, land use change, and contamination interact with the environment to impact our water. Now, the methods I'm trained in are mostly in computer modeling, and I think these are really powerful because they can provide us predictions of what's going on when we can't directly observe them. But more recently, some tribal partners I'm working with, one in particular, pointed out that doing this kind of computer work in isolation of spending time actually outside and in the environment is really just like using a prosthetic because it's really not the real thing. So I came here to Minnesota with my, I guess, fancy computer models. That's how I felt at the time, almost 8 years ago. And at that time, there was a heated debate going on here, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with or have heard about our state's unique water quality standard to control the levels of sulfate that are allowed to be released in wild rice lakes and streams. And this was, of course, set to protect wild rice. Now, the controversy came in, though, because taconite mining releases high levels of sulfate. But these mining companies were really pushing back on the standard because they argued that there was really no proof that sulfate harms Manoomin or Psiĩ. Now, what followed was state-funded research that actually did demonstrate that when sulfate gets into the lake bed or stream bed, it can convert into something called sulfide, which is poisonous to Manoomin or Psiĩ. Okay, so it kind of seemed like a closed case, right? Sulfate leads to a problem for Manoomin or Psiĩ. Well, industries continued to push back because they pointed to sites that seemed to buck this trend. And this caught my attention. I wanted to help tribes, and I could see how certain kinds of groundwater movement and complex chemical reactions may actually allow for a handful of sites to buck the trend. And I thought that if we can explain the handful of exceptions, then industries couldn't keep using them as distractions from the fact that in the vast majority of cases, sulfate is indeed bad news for wild rice. So I came in with my, expert computer models, and I actually started to collect some field data for this work. And I got really excited because I was finding things that other scientists hadn't realized before about hydrological fluxes and sulfate. And I got even more excited as I teamed up with a geochemist and microbiologist, and together we came up with a fancy new scientific model about groundwater, sulfur, iron, and carbon. And so all was going, gotta say, pretty well for me. We published 2 papers about our hydrological, geochemical, and microbiological findings. And it was really great for building up my new career here at the U. But something was starting to bother me. First off, what actually happened to the wild rice? You might have noticed that I hardly mentioned it at all, really, as I got carried away with all the hydrology and biogeochemistry. And secondly, what about people? I thought that my original motivation for doing this work was the fact that tribes are having their wild rice threatened by industrial activities, and yet people never really came into my research picture at all. And so I started to do some reading about tribes and wild rice. And as I did, I began to realize that I really couldn't with good conscience keep ignoring the human side of things. And here's why. I'm embarrassed to say that really for the first time, I learned that Minnesota violently appropriated Dakota lands to establish the U on the Twin Cities campus. And fast forward about a century, and I learned that university agronomists started to cultivate wild rice and paddies and began genetic research, and they did this without tribal consent. And I started to understand that Manoomin or Psiη is central to the identity of many tribes. And as sovereign nations, their right to Manoomin or Psiĩ is a legal treaty right. And now, tribes made their objections to the U's research absolutely clear. In 1998, the MCT wrote a letter to the university saying that we object to the exploitation of our wild rice for pecuniary or for financial gain. And again, tribes in a letter said to the University of Minnesota that they demanded a moratorium on genomic research and genetic research of wild rice. I think you're going to be hearing a lot more about this history of wild rice research at the University of Minnesota at tomorrow's presentation by Chris Rico. Okay, so here I came in 2015 and I began research on wild rice waters. And I have to confess that I also did it with absolutely no tribal input. And while I focused on what I thought was, the real science, the university was taking state funds to reinvigorate its cultivated wild rice and genetics research program. And so when I took a step back and started to take all this in, I realized that I needed to take a new approach. And that's why in 2017, I pulled together an interdisciplinary team from across the campus. This time included not just my usual biophysical science collaborators, but also social scientists and native researchers. We were really fortunate to have Mark Belcourt, a White Earth member who had long been pushing the U to work more ethically with tribes. And we also pulled in Mike Dockery, who's here in this presentation with us today. He's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi tribe. And a few years ago, he was hired into a new faculty position in tribal natural resources, and since then has been playing a major role in moving forward our collaborative. I think maybe many of you have met him already. Perhaps he's already been talking during this program, this Truth program. And in 2017, our group was able to secure a grant from the university's Grand Challenges program to do interdisciplinary work around Manoomin or Psiĩ. And so here we were in 2017. I was feeling pretty good that we were finally doing things the right way. After all, we had 5 letters of support from tribes or tribal organizations. But you know what? Even at this point, I have to confess something else. Even though we had already formed our interdisciplinary team, some of our tribal contacts were pointing out that some of us non-native researchers, including myself, we still hadn't fully understood the situation. And here's why. Around the same time that we were notified about our grant, tensions around wild rice genetics research at the U was really reaching a new high at a symposium attended by university members and tribal members. And all of us researchers on the new grant attended the symposium. And I have to say that even though at that point we had already written our proposal, it was only for the very first time that I directly heard tribal members explain that Manoomin is relative. And it was the first time that I was listening to tribal members describe the pain that they experienced to have their sacred Manoomin exploited through University of Minnesota research. And I was realizing that the university's leadership was still inadequately responding to why it was that genetic research on Manoomin will continue at the U, despite tribes' repeated protests. And you know what? It was at the symposium that it was the first time that I was talking with our tribal contacts after learning that we got the grant. Now, I expected that they would all be really excited, right? But I was really thrown off because some of them seemed to be hanging back, and they said that I failed to fully involve them in the proposal writing process. And I actually really didn't understand this. I mean, after all, didn't we have 5 tribal letters of support? Well, our tribal contacts pointed out something that will sound really obvious to you, but it's something that we as non-native researchers too often forget when we're really fixated on just getting out our publications. And it's that true collaboration requires far more than simply securing those letters of support and writing just a few emails. It's a relationship among individuals, and it takes time, goodwill, and a lot of listening to build, especially considering all the thought history that the university has had with tribes around wild rice. And so that's when I began to realize that yes, With the new disciplinary grant, I now had people involved who think about people who care about Manoomin or Psiη. But what was still missing from this picture are those people who care about Manoomin or Psiĩ, which is why this is where we are today with the full list of team members in our collaborative project here. But how did we get here? Well, that's the journey of our collaborative, which started with relationship building. So at the beginning of our grant, we set aside our original research plan, which had insufficient, some, but really insufficient tribal input. And instead, we traveled. We traveled around Minnesota and Wisconsin, and we simply listened to different tribes and tribal organizations. We had no agenda at all. And that's where we continued to learn about tribes' experiences with researchers. We learned that researchers have trespassed on reservations to collect their samples. We learned that geologic mapping has happened on reservations, and this has led to attempts by mining companies to exploit resources. And we learned that tribal members have been written into grant proposals to fulfill outreach requirements without even being asked. And we learned that researchers have worked with tribes to benefit their own careers, and then they walked away after their 3-year projects were done. So it was absolutely right that our tribal contacts were calling out some of us at the symposium for being on the path of repeating many of these same mistakes. And so it's been from these visits that I began to realize that I had been far too fixated on sulfate just because of my own research interests. Tribal partners explained something they repeatedly try to get across to state agencies, which is that yes, sulfate is extremely important as a problem on the Iron Range, but there are many other environmental stressors also threatening Manoomin or Psiĩ. And we needed to address all of these if we wanted to help Manoomin or Psiĩ everywhere that it's declining. And so partners from 10 different bands and tribal organizations helped us expand our picture from 3 originally proposed study sites, all chosen by me based on their sulfate levels, to include over 30 Manoomin or Psiĩ sites of concern, which encompass a far greater diversity in conditions than what we could have come up with on our own. Now you'll notice that these sites include those in Minnesota and in Wisconsin. But I have to say, at first, we were only going to work in Minnesota because our grant came from the University of Minnesota. But the St. Croix tribe challenged us on this and asked why wouldn't we also help their Manoomin? They had us realize that we certainly should not base our work on colonial boundaries. And Lac du Flambeau tribal members explained it well when they said that Manoomin has no state or county boundaries on where it will grow and provide sustenance for our families and a healthy environment for the winged ones, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl, and the 4-legged ones. So after all our initial missteps, I really wasn't sure if in the first year any tribes that would want to work with us at all. But a turning point really came when we started to recruit Native and non-Native students. They became a common rallying point as tribes and university researchers share in the same goal of preparing the next generation to be even better scientists and stewards of the environment. And our students have been teaching all of us what it looks like to reach across different backgrounds and experiences to work together. And in addition to individual visits to tribes and tribal organizations, we've also had twice per year conferences for everyone to come together and discuss what their understanding about Manoomin or Psiĩ. And it's been through these conferences that we've been able to see our partnership grow. You know, our first conference was held at Fond du Lac Reservation, and we heard a lot of wariness about university researchers, and all for very good reasons considering our track record. But our second conference, we started to follow tribal partners' suggestions. We included an elders panel where we were able to hear about their invaluable insights about Manoomin. And at our third conference, Lac du Flambeau partners brought their Wigwam Junior Drum Group, and they set a good tone for our conference. Our fourth conference, we co-hosted the next installment of the Nibi Manoomin Symposium. And very different from the previous symposium, which was so filled with tension, this time, there were new women leaders, tribal, university, and state. They spoke together and they actually shared a meal together. So we were on our way to building genuine relationships with our tribal partners, but we knew that before carrying out any actual research activities together, it was essential to establish a protocol to ensure that our work supports tribal sovereignty. And so that's why we pulled together a working group consisting of university researchers and tribal partners to develop a protocol. Now, actions are even more important than a written document, but a formal document that we can return to helps hold all of us accountable. Now, we have a general protocol that serves as a standing point for a specific MOU signed with individual tribes. And I shared the full protocol with the Truth program, so I think that you have it all available as a resource. Now, it's quite a lengthy document, and so here in this slide, I've just distilled into some of the main points here. And this is still a lot of text here, so I'm just going to briefly highlight some major points and provide a quick, just some quick examples of how we're following this protocol. So first off, our protocol covers project procedures. To make sure we have regular and meaningful communications, we have monthly Zoom meetings, and we send around written meeting summaries, knowing that not everyone can attend these meetings. And before any field work is done on reservation lands and unceded territory, we always submit research plans to corresponding tribes or treaty authorities for approval before moving forward with any work. Now, to ensure communities are benefiting from the work that we're doing, we really essentially threw away our original research plan, and we developed new ones with tribal partners who have a much better understanding of what their communities need. And we've been following guidelines for doing research with tribal members and Indigenous peoples. For example, we submitted an application to the White Earth Institutional Review Board, and actually it wasn't approved. And so even though we have White Earth members with whom we're discussing things, and they've been playing an important role in guiding our research, we have not been conducting any field work on White Earth reservation lands. And we're also respecting traditional knowledge. We know to never expect that tribes will share their knowledge with us. It's simply not our place to ask for this. But when a tribal partner wants us to consider traditional knowledge, we will, and we will do so with deference and care, and we'll only use that knowledge in ways that they feel comfortable with. And for research with animals, plants, and habitats, we understand that Manoomin or Psiη is a relative for tribal communities, and so we adhere to White Earth's Declaration of Rights of Manoomin. And in that vein, we agree to do no harm to Manoomin or Psiĩ as defined by our tribal partners. We understand that some tribal members object to removing or damaging wild rice for research purposes. And so we do all we can to minimally disturb any stands, such as timing our field work around during really sensitive times for Manoomin or Psiĩ. And for project outcomes, we always invite tribal partners to serve as co-authors, and we give the credit that they deserve for the knowledge that they co-produce with us. Now, finally, data ownership, sharing, and dissemination. This is about data sovereignty, which quite simply means that data we collect should belong to tribes. This is really important, but I have to say it's also been a challenging issue. And that's because we found that university and funding agency policies don't always by default allow us to hand over full control of data to tribes. But we've been working with funding agencies to meet our tribal partner requests, and we make it clear to tribes when and what we can do, what we can and cannot do to legally assure them control over the data. So if there's any sensitive data that we cannot guarantee that we can protect, we simply do not collect it. And we always allow review by tribes before we do any kind of data release or publication. And so with this protocol, we have been conducting field work, always together with our tribal partners. In some of these fieldwork trips, we've also been using as knowledge exchange workshops, such as what you see in these photos here from Lac de Flambeau. While we were demonstrating some of our sampling methods with their tribal environmental division, we had tribal members teaching us how to carve knocking sticks and make birch bark baskets so that we, as researchers, could learn to respect Indigenous customs, values, and understandings. And as we spent more and more time with tribal partners, some of them have started to explain a bit about how they think about Manoomin. And of course, we did not take for granted that this would happen because, as I mentioned before, we knew not to assume that tribal members would share their traditional knowledge with us, especially considering the long history of appropriation. But some of our partners began to explain that they always consider Manoomin or Psiη in relationship with all the non-human and human elements around it. And I've come to learn that Indigenous knowledge is holistic, integrative, and relational. And this is really in contrast to the Western science that I've been trained in, which we like to really break things up into small pieces and disciplines. And this has actually been serving as a problem for actually understanding how environmental systems come together. And so it's been a huge honor and a tremendous sign of trust that some of our tribal partners have been asking us to include some of their traditional knowledge in our collaborative research. And I have to say that including tribal priorities and knowledge has been completely transforming the way that I think about my research. And I know other researchers on the project feel the same way. And so here are just some of the ways that this has been happening. Now, we're usually just rushing around to get all our research done, our fieldwork done, but one of the first times we were out at the Lac de Flambeau study site, our partner there slowed us down and he said this. He said, when you're out there doing your sediment sampling, don't forget to look around. Notice the water, the other plants, the animals. Remember the other spirits out there because that might tell you what's going on with Manoomin. And sure enough, once we started to look around and listen to our tribal partners, it started to open our eyes to so many different things. Now, as a hydrologist, of course, I'm always looking for questions related to water. Now, tribes have long understood the intimate connection between Manoomin and Psiĩ. After all, for the Anishinaabe, Manoomin is that food that grows on the water, and it's the reason why they are here where they are today, because they came to this part of North America seeking that food that grows on water. Now, it's been interesting that many of our tribal partners have been asking about the role of groundwater. And I was really excited about this because I felt like I could really put my groundwater hydrology skills to use here. Now, what really struck me though, was that one day, one of our tribal partners explained to me that he said, we have a word to refer to that part of the stream bed where water from above meets water from below. This completely blew my mind because in hydrology, it's become really trendy to look at how groundwater and surface water interact with each other. But the Anishinaabe have long had a word in their everyday vocabulary to talk about this concept. And sediments, many tribal partners were really urging us to take a close look at sediments, even though, there's really not much mention about the importance of sediment in the scientific literature. So I kept wondering why this issue of sediments kept coming up. And a Glyphwig partner explained it to me this way. She said, of course we know the sediment is important. It's what muskrat picked up and put on turtles back in our origin story. And sure enough, when we started to analyze the sediment, we do seem to be seeing a relationship with wild rice abundance. And so we had a different worldview here from what us researchers usually look at, and there's something new and important to look at. Okay, so I thought we were finally getting the hang of things and we were thinking about things holistically. We were coming up with all these proposals about all these different things that could be related to each other in the stream bed. And yet, you know what? We still weren't getting the full picture. One of our tribal partners at Fond du Lac pointed out that we still didn't get it all. She started asking what happens though if the forest around the Manoomin Lake changes, for example, under climate change. And we started looking into this. Sure enough, she was right. This could be affecting the amount and quality of water that runs off into a Manoomin lake. Now, clearly, you can see that as a biophysical or as an environmental scientist, I'm still much more used to thinking about the non-human side of things. But fortunately, we have social scientists on our project as well who've been thinking more about the human dimensions. And following tribal requests, they've been conducting harvester surveys to see how harvesters' values and practices can be influencing Manoomin or Psiĩ health. And they've been also working with tribal partners to analyze what happened during the tribal consultation process around the wild rice sulfate standard so that they can identify the elements that make up meaningful consultation. So, having tribal priorities and knowledge guide our Western science research has been absolutely awesome for us. But to be honest, I started to worry. If our tribal partners are always teaching us researchers things, is there anything at all that we're doing that's actually benefiting them? Or are we the only ones that are benefiting? Well, a Fond du Lac partner reassured us by saying that even when Western science results are simply showing what tribes already knew, this still can be very useful for tribes in legal cases because academic publications can be very powerful for litigation purposes. And another Lac du Flambeau partner also said that she thought it was still useful to be working together. She believed that both tribal knowledge, or TEK, and Western science are needed to best steward Manoomin. She found that reciprocal support between tribal knowledge and Western science can help to validate each other. And she said that it can deepen our understanding of environmental threats. And sure enough, we are starting to see this in some of our research at the Lac du Flambeau Manoomin site. We're seeing how TEK about the importance of dark places and old growth conifer forests is helping to calibrate my hydrologic computer models. And in turn, our computer models can provide insights and predictions as to how climate change may impact Manoomin lakes and streams in the future. And so as you can see then, co-production and sharing of knowledge by tribal communities and university researchers is showing that we can deepen our understanding of the environment, and it can ensure that our research benefits tribal communities. Okay, so our grant from the university ran out last year already, but our co-production of knowledge around Manoomin or Psiη has really only just begun, and we're finding ways to further extend our efforts to support tribes. Now, funding is always a challenge, but our University of Minnesota team made a commitment to continue our support of tribes in Manoomin and Psiη, even if we couldn't find more funding right away. Now, I can tell you, I have never worked harder on a research proposal before, because I finally understood the tremendous importance of this research for Manoomin and Psiη, as well as the seriousness of our commitment to tribes. And other researchers on the project felt the same way as me, as we each took turns to lead off on different proposals. And our collective hard work has paid off, as we were awarded 3 new collaborative grants this past year to continue our work. And each of our grants has named tribal partners. And importantly, Fond du Lac, Lac du Flambeau, and 1854 Treaty Authority are all receiving their own budgets from these grants. But I do want to emphasize that beyond the tribes and tribal organizations formally listed on those new grants, we intend for the funds to fully benefit and also benefit other tribes participating on the collaborative. Now, I know the font on this list of team members is really small, so I'll point out that participants include members or representatives from each of the 7 federally recognized Anishinaabe tribes in Minnesota, as well as a few other Anishinaabe tribes from Wisconsin and Michigan. There are also affiliations from tribes outside of the region, as Native students have come from around the US looking for the opportunity to work closely with tribes. But I'll also fully acknowledge right now that what is glaringly missing from this list are Dakota tribes. And this is a major problem because the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus was established using violently appropriate Dakota lands. And Psiη has been culturally important to the Dakota even before the Anishinaabe arrived to this part of North America. And so that's why over the past year, we've been working hard to remedy this, and we've been starting to engage with Minnesota's Dakota tribes. And these efforts are really mostly led by Mike Dockery. Each of the 4 federally recognized Dakota tribes in Minnesota has had representatives attend our meetings in the past year, and at our last collaboration conference, which was virtual, they presented about their work that they've been doing to restore Psiη. And as we're building our relationships with them, we're looking for ways that we can support Dakota tribes if they are interested in working with us. And also, in order to extend the reach of our work, we published a paper about the crucial partnership building step of collaboration with tribes, so that we can share what we've learned with others. And to give due credit, this paper lists 38 co-authors, including tribal partners and Native and non-Native university researchers and students. And you can get a copy of this paper from the Truth Program, and hopefully this can be another resource that is useful for you. Now, we've been doing our best to disseminate this paper widely to other researchers within the U and beyond, so that hopefully others will also learn to work collaboratively and respectfully with tribes. Now, on a personal note, my eyes have been totally opened through my experiences working with tribal partners. So I have felt strongly compelled to find ways to support tribes beyond my participation on the Manoomin and Psiη Collaborative. And so that's why over the last couple of years, I've been working to incorporate Indigenous issues in my teaching. And to ensure that tribal voices come through, I've had guest presenters and consultants working with me from Anishinaabe and Dakota tribes. And I also hope to push for more accountable relationships with tribes by everyone in my Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. And I think this is really important because as a department with roots in geology, our discipline has been responsible for the degradation and dispossession of Indigenous lands. So rather than post a generic land acknowledgement, we're striving to make actionable commitments to learn about past and ongoing harms that we're responsible for, and to set new guidelines for ethically responsible work on Indigenous lands and with Indigenous communities, locally and globally. And we've been really fortunate to be able to hire Gabriela Inez Diaz to help us develop these commitments. She's a young Indigenous scholar who's recently graduated from the U with a major in American Indian Studies and a minor in environmental geosciences from my department. Not only has she been sharing her knowledge with us, but she's been helping connect my department with other Dakota and Anishinaabe experts who we've been able to compensate for giving input into our process. So it does look like that hopefully our collaborative is helping to move the U off of the fraught path and into a new way of doing research that is ethically responsible, collaborative, holistic, and honors tribal sovereignty. But you know what? Once again, I have to make another confession. And that's because last spring, tribes learned that genetic research on natural stands of wild rice has resumed at the U by a lab that is unaffiliated with our group. And as this earlier timeline shows, tribes have repeatedly made their position clear that there should be no wild rice genetics research being done without their consultation. So honestly, it kind of feels like Groundhog Day because it looks like we may have taken a U-turn and we're returning right back into this fraught space here. And in response, MCT released a resolution last June calling out the U for holding up our group's collaborative work while at the very same time housing genetic research that tribes vehemently object to. And the resolution demands that the U stop the genetic research or else MCT will consider pulling out of all of its collaborations with the U. Now, I can't lie, this was difficult to hear. Just as we won 3 new grants to move forward our collaborative, it may all come to a halt. But you know what? Honestly, what frustrated our team even more than the threat of losing our projects was the fact that there is still so much work to be done to stop research that harms tribes. University researchers on the collaborative have written a letter supporting the MCT resolution, and we stated that we would without hesitation stop our work if asked to do so by our tribal partners. In fact, that is what is required for us to do by our signed MOUs with tribes. We can only work on we can only do work that tribes agree to us doing. So I'd say that here we are at a bit of a crossroads. Do we regress even farther back along the fraught timeline? Or can we urge others at the U and beyond to push forward onto a new track that respects tribal perspectives? So I'd say personally, I have felt hopeful about where tribal-university relations could be heading in the next part of the timeline. I feel that our current president, Joan Gable, has really made important strides in kind of in the relations with tribes. And she's hired Tad Johnson and Karen Diver to play important roles in helping to repair the U's relations with tribes. And so to me, it seems like the U is pledging to do better in its relationship with tribes. But I, of course, understand the wariness that I hear from many of our tribal partners, that there's been a very long history of broken promises. So hopefully, if the U can be held accountable to tribes, including through collaborative work like our Manoomin Psiη project, and through efforts like this Truth program, then hopefully we can get the U to get off of the fraught path and stop and reverse the harms done to tribal communities and their relatives, and do work that is ethically responsible, collaborative, holistic, and honoring of tribal sovereignty. So I have a number of closing thoughts here that researchers such as myself, we must learn that Manoomin or Psiĩ holds deep cultural importance to Native people and it's legally protected by treaties. And we have to understand that settler colonial past and present call for new protocols that uphold tribal sovereignty, ethical practices, and relationship building. And I've realized that collaboration requires researchers to listen, have humility, and spend time together with tribal partners and communities. And so when we can do collaboration together with tribal partners, it makes our research more just and it makes our science so much better. And so with that, I'll leave you with this photo from a wild rice feast at the Lac de Flambeau Roundhouse. And this quote from a student's intern's final report captures perfectly what we've been trying to do. This project was not only about the science and fieldwork, she said, but about the connections and the people involved. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I'll point you to our website where you can learn more about our collaborative. And I'm happy to take any questions, but I also hope that you take this opportunity to hold the researchers on this collaborative, and as well as me personally, accountable. And so I welcome you to share any concerns that you may have about our collaborative research around Manoomin Psiη, or share any aspects that you feel in our protocol that resonated with you, or whether there were certain points that we could have better emphasized. And I'm also interested to hear whether you think our protocol for responsible research is missing anything. And on a personal note, I'm interested in whether you have feedback on my own efforts to push Indigenous issues forward beyond the Manoomin and Psiĩ collaborative, such as what I'm doing in my teaching or throughout my Earth and Environmental Sciences department. And finally, are there further collaborations or connections with your tribe that we or I should be considering, such as other divisions or departments, groups, or tribal colleges? But with that, I'd really just like to open it up. And I'm actually, even though I'd like to have this list up here, I might just stop sharing my screen so that I can actually see everyone. So thank you. And yes, as Misty pointed out, I think I shared both our published paper about partnership building as well as the protocol that we follow for all of our research. I shared that with her, and I believe it's uploaded to the folder that you all have access to.
I guess I'd like to add is that I really appreciate the ownership of where you come from, like your family history. I don't know if you guys hear me, the TV's on in the background now, but that's not something that we necessarily see in spaces, is that type of ownership. And I think that is also a part of the conversation when people make those clarifications and those distinctions. And it's also like about accountability too, you know what I mean? There's so much when somebody makes those kind of statements, you know what I mean? It's so much more meaningful than just those few words.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Adriana. And I would say I've learned from our tribal partners to do that. I'd say that in our Western science training, we're really taught to, to distance ourselves and be quote unquote objective, where I think it's never a reality to be objective. And so because of that reality, because it's not possible to be objective, I've learned that it's really most appropriate just to put out there immediately just your own position so that everyone can understand what kind of biases I might be coming to the table with. And it's something that I've tried to pass along to my students. And I pointed out, I tried to assign readings from Native scholars. Oh, hello. To Native scholars who I find are often, in the beginning of their papers, they're explaining their identities and their positions. And, and I point that out to my students that this helps us understand where they're coming from. And I think non-Native researchers should be doing this as well.
Puja Crystal, thank you so much for your presentation. I think it gave us a lot to think about as we go through this project. One of the things I was wondering is if you could talk more about your data sovereignty practices. That's something that we wrote into our grant and are already kind of coming up against some tension in the university. So just want to hear more about your experiences. Thanks.
Hi, Anne, it's good to see you. And we're so appreciative that Anne was willing to share some of her insights and expertise with our department in our process of trying to make commitments, actionable commitments to Indigenous peoples and lands. So I just wanted to say that first and foremost, thank you. And thanks for this really important question. I think that data sovereignty is so critical and also, unfortunately, so challenging. Now, as a scientist, I've been trying to wrap my head around what I'm understanding to be legal aspects of this. I was involved early on, along with a couple other members of our collaborative on the university side. We were involved in some meetings with the legal counsel at University of Minnesota. And that's when I was really shocked to learn that I don't have the right to give away my own rights. Like we wanted to have in our protocol, in our MOU, that we hand our rights to data collected on this project to tribes because they should own it. And we were writing this and it all seemed to just make a lot of logical sense. And then I think just someone on our project, university researcher who had a little bit more experience with this, she flagged and she's like, actually the university legal department might have some issues with this. And sure enough, apparently intellectual property is ours. And it was such a just weird meeting because the university lawyer we talked to, I realized the first half of the meeting, he didn't understand because I think he's really usually only called in to help protect researchers' rights to their intellectual property. And I think it just totally confused him. And he kept thinking he was misunderstanding us when we kept saying, no, we wanted to give away our right because it shouldn't be a right that we ever had to begin with if we're collecting tribal data. And so there was a lot of back and forth. And honestly, at that time, there was someone on our project, Laura Matson, who's a legal geographer. She's since moved on. She was a postdoc on our project. And I think she understood some more of the legal intricacies and, what happens if we were to get FOIA'd and, and there's a legal, demand that we release data. And I will say that at the end of the day, in our protocol, what we were able to reassure is that we will always allow, we will never publish anything. We will never release any data without first allowing our tribal partners to review it. What we cannot explicitly say is that we will not publish it if they don't agree to it. So we can just say that tribes can review it, and we can tell our tribal partners that we have zero intention of publishing anything that they do not approve. But we also, make clear that if we are FOIA'd, if there is a legal case that comes forward and a court, judge demands that we hand over data, we legally actually would have to do so, is my understanding from our conversation with the legal counsel. And it ended up not being terribly helpful talking with him because he really only just kept wanting to tell us about all of the rights that we retain as researchers to our data. So I think that's why I was saying that if we feel that we are, possibly going to be collecting any data that's sensitive, I mean, all of our research plans are always fully discussed with our tribal partners before anything is collected. And if there's ever this concern that data won't that we won't be able to protect this data, we just won't collect it. That's why our application to the White Earth's Institutional Review Board was rejected because they said that they did not see that their data sovereignty could be what could be held up to the levels that they needed it to be. And that's why we've also had some other tribal partners with whom we do collect data, but there are certain types of data that we don't collect because they do consider it to be more sensitive. Another example that I can talk about is the National Science Foundation, I think, is pretty typical of many federal funders, which is that any money and any data that we collect using funds from them, because it's taxpayer dollars, we have to make publicly available. So we had a discussion with all the tribal partners who are listed on our grant. And we did have one tribal partner who wanted their sites to be anonymized. So they actually felt okay with the data being posted to a publicly accessible data repository, but they wanted their site to be anonymized. So what we did was I went through a number of different environmental science data repositories, and I contacted people there, and I asked whether the bounding box of the coordinate system of, when we posted data, how broad can I have it be? Can I just say that it was somewhere in Wisconsin? Can I say it was only just somewhere on this reservation without saying where exactly it is? And they got back to me and they said, you know what? There's nothing in our rules that define what resolution you need to say your location is at. So actually, technically that's fine. And so that's what we do with that particular tribal partner, is we always anonymize the location of the data that we collect together with them. And we were able to make that work out with our funding agency and with the data repositories. But I think you can tell from my extraordinarily lengthy and not very articulate answer that I think it's difficult. And I know that there are others who are doing a lot more work on this and understand it on a much deeper level than I understand it. I know at University of Arizona, there is there's an effort to look at data sovereignty. And I don't know if any others on this call actually have more insights that they'd like to share from their experiences.
I would recommend being in contact with Jane Anderson if you haven't already. She's an intellectual property rights attorney. And, I work a lot with her. We've probably worked together for over a decade on and off. And it's absolutely possible to enter into agreements with the community where if they don't want you to publish something, you don't publish something. You can guarantee them that you will not publish something. It's absolutely possible for the community to retain all the information that they wish to retain and keep those things sensitive. Now, if you're receiving federal grants that have other, things that you're required to adhere to, then perhaps you don't apply for those federal grants for this. Perhaps you get funding elsewhere. I mean, you mentioned that your commitment was so strong to tribes that, you were willing to do this work even without the funding. So do it without that funding. And if you can come up with these other types of really strong agreements with tribes, then use that as your model for the university as a whole to adhere to, because it's absolutely possible to, like White Earth would agree to something if they could retain the data. And they have agreed to plenty of things with other institutions because they retain that data. And it's possible to retain that data. So I think that's an area to potentially focus on, because it exists. It's not, you're not bound by these legal loopholes that make it to where, gee, I wish I could do this, but we can't. You can. You might not be talking to the right people yet. And so I just think, there's that focus in the research about studying the social culture. Like how much more do you need to know that it's important to the people? Can you now redirect your focus to those legal barriers that you now face so that tribes can get what they need, the protection they need to do the work that has to be done can be done? We know it's important, we know it's sacred, we know it's sensitive, we know it's threatened. Can we now focus on what are the blocks that allow us or prevent us from getting to the next step? So I think you've done amazing. And I think that you shouldn't settle for any attorney, university or otherwise, telling you that this is not a possible thing, because it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I will absolutely acknowledge that it's always the part that I feel uneasy about, and we do get asked. And, you know, I think you're absolutely right that the time, I mean, it's probably even overdue for us to circle back at this. You know, I think we had some, as you said, we were probably not talking with the right people. And I think we had tribal partners, we had some tribal partners who felt okay with this parameters at the time. But I think, and this is where I am asking all of you to help hold us accountable, I think we need to constantly be pushing, right? And so I think this is an area I absolutely acknowledge we should be pushing more on. Can I just ask, you mentioned the IP attorney, Jane Anderson. Where is she at
I think she's
law
at Columbia University, if I remember right. NYU, I think. So she's somewhere in New York City. I'm trying to remember.
Okay.
We used to work together at a different institution. She went to New York. So now I'm trying to remember where she's at. But she was one of the folks that started MOOC too. So it's not a science-based thing, but more of a cultural item-based thing. But it's all about tribes retaining their own information, sensitive information, and yet being able to share data back and forth with each other. And, you know, she's now gone off and done a lot of work with in relation to science. You know, where does our biological information go when there's someone studying a community and such. And so she's done a lot of that and helps tribes maintain and retain all of their information that they wish to. And so, like, you know, if you've got a community that cares so much about wild rice that they kind of have to grit their teeth a little bit, grind their teeth a little bit, and just go along with the regulations that you're saying that this is it, I wish we could do better, we can't, this is all that's possible. There's more that's possible. And a community shouldn't have to like have that unease and that fear because they think that this is the only way that they're going to protect that rice for the future. Like I don't want, you know, a FOIA, I don't want this, I don't want that, but I'm going to have to go along with this because, you know, this is the only way we can get this data. This is the only way we can get this level of protection. I mean, I know that there's even just different ways of recording data and different ways of recording meeting minute notes. And the feds do it too. The Smithsonian does it. You know, like they'll, just in case a FOIA is ever asked, there's no sensitive information about a tribe that's provided. So there's ways that even the feds are doing it. And there's no reason that the university can't be able to engage in a relationship with different tribes where the tribes can breathe that sigh of relief and then focus on the actual work. You know, like they know that whatever it is that's sensitive to them, whether it's a location or a specific story or a specific, you know, concern, like those things can remain, they can remain not public or not studied or not, you know, owned by the university. There's just a way around that.
That would be something great to hear in the reports that you are all developing as well, just to reiterate it, because clearly the University Council is not, doesn't have the knowledge or skills to do what needs to be done in this instance. And so I think it would be good to see some of that as a recommendation as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I mean, because, you know, university attorneys, they got to wear so many different hats, so many different kinds of law, right? And thinking creatively and kind of branching out and looking at how others are doing things, that they don't necessarily have the time for that, but it's possible. It's completely possible. And that would just, you know, if the university could get on board and say, okay, we're committed to this truth project, we're committed to having these better relationships. These are examples of how other institutions have done this, and we're going to commit to this. You know, this is something the tribes want, you know, assuming that all the tribes look at this and they're like, okay, we feel more comfortable this way than that way, then there's no reason that we couldn't do this, you know?
And I think too that universities, systems, etc., use policy, use the legal systems as a tool to oppress people and to oppress this kind of research, etc., etc. And I think that we have an opportunity as tribal nations, as tribal citizens, representatives of tribes, to embrace some of those tools to use to our advantage. You know what I mean? I think that there is a hesitancy within tribal nations to utilize legal measures as a way for remedies. But the reality of it is that, you know, we have to be able to find a balance with these systems and with some of these tools, and really just embracing them. You know, we have the education, we have the knowledge to be able to represent ourselves in court, and we've worked very, very hard to be able to do that. There is a plethora of knowledge in this space alone. I oftentimes say that the wisdom we seek is in the spaces that we create. There's so much wisdom here in this space, you know what I mean? There's so much, and really just embracing some of those tools that have been used to oppress us and flip the switch. I guess that's what I have to recommend.
Can you guys hear me? Hey, good to see you, Crystal. That was awesome, and inspiring and exciting. What Adriana just said about taking ownership or reclaiming, maybe we can use that word, resources like law, for example. I think it's important to also extend to thinking critically about research generally. That research, as much as it's been a tool of colonialism, the way law is also, like law, doesn't necessarily belong to colonizers. You know, so research is, and I'm giving all of you a sort of just a nod to some of the things that I'm going to say at noon today on behalf of American Indian Studies as a unit, as a field of research that is committed to Native sovereignty, but also to research that boldly addresses contradictions and messiness within Native worlds as much as it does within colonial worlds. And so the question of research being, for example, beholden to what a tribe wants and needs, as much as that's a necessary groundwork for research, the field of Native studies has also refused to restrict the need for research for Indigenous people, including tribes, to only what tribal government and governance identifies. And this is a very complex, messy, political issue that's rife with contradictions and stuff like that. So for example, it was nice to see in Crystal's slide where she's going beyond the research project and incorporating work from Native studies in her teaching, and in going beyond, she had a picture of Linda Tuhiwai Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodology. If you weren't familiar with that book, you should be. It's a classic. The cover that Crystal showed, is a 2016 version, but the book came out actually in 1999. And Linda Smith, a Maori intellectual, how she does her work is actually far, far, far more complicated than what she presents in the book. And so Maori research that is at once fiercely forged in relations to tribes is also boldly refusing to be bound only to tribes. And that's because tribal governance is a very dynamic and fluid thing. And so what that means is that research that's dedicated to Indigenous issues and realities must necessarily also be able to and be skilled at facing the contradictions and the conflicts within Indigenous worlds. As someone who's been in this field for a long time, all of the work that is emerging around the interface between doing good research, good scientific or social science research in the academy with natives is still far, far, far beyond behind the kind of native research, that native people are doing within their communities and across communities that must necessarily deal with the politics, the internal politics that one finds in native worlds. So this is not a criticism at all. I think as someone who's only been here for 5 years, the work that Crystal and Mike are doing is absolutely cutting edge leadership for us. The kind of work that needs to be done with tribes. But I just wanted to put that out there.
This is Bill Freeman. I'm a presenter in the next session, but I've been on from the beginning, as you may have seen. I'm a physician and health researcher, not like Crystal, different kind of research. But Crystal, I just wanted to say, as they say at Lummi, Haishka Siem. Very good presentation on something I am not at all familiar in terms of the topic, but the real topic was about how to do good research with tribes. And I wanted to say I appreciate that. And just addition to Vincent Diaz, and your comments were right on. So thank you both. Haishka.
Well, I'd just like to thank you both, Bill and Vince, for your kind words, but actually also just echo what Vince just pointed out, which is that in so many ways, we're really not doing anything new, right? And that's the incredible, mind-blowing thing for me. You know, reading Decolonizing Methodologies was a difficult read for someone like me who usually, you know, looks at, you know, science literature and equations and stuff like that. But when I did, I realized I haven't done anything new. We're you know, just as you said, I guess Linda Smith wrote that in the 90s. I mean, everything that's that's been new for me and mind-blowing for me, Indigenous communities have been doing for a long time now. And so I hope that our project can provide an example for how, you know, that kind of community engaged, respectful work can be brought into a realm where it isn't always followed, but there are just clear examples. And I think we really do need to give credit back to Indigenous scholars and communities who have been teaching us and demonstrating to us how how it's done, I think I definitely want to respond with that first and foremost. And then I think a second thing is that even though in a lot of ways the work isn't easy, it's also almost stupidly easy what this work takes. And I often say it just takes being a decent human being and listening and considering the perspectives and the experiences of other people. You know, is that really so hard? Why is it that somehow along the way that got cut out of doing rigorous scientific research?
Can I just add to that? I wanted to say that, respond to you, Crystal, like, yes and no. Native people have been doing research for a long, long time, but not within academia. And so, and Linda would be, I know her quite well. I've been reading her for a long time, and she's just a few years older than me. She'd be the first person to tell you, we still don't know how to do academic research, indigenous academic research that perfectly aligns what we know and what we think is needed for indigenous people, and to also cut it as solid research. In other words, truth and evidence and those kinds of things. And so so I kind of put it in the chat there. Not indigenous people have not been doing research. There's been indigenous academics who've been doing solid work for a long time, but it's been a very complicated, contradictory filled kind of thing, full of tensions, full of these kinds of things. And even the work that indigenous people have been doing within academia, it hasn't I believe that the hardest, indigenous people doing research in their own communities is actually probably the hardest kind of work one can do, precisely because we're positioned in very specific and complex ways, genealogically and politically and things like that within our own communities. And so it's not like there's a lot of models out there or in here. I've certainly not seen research work the kind that you guys are doing that has been as generative and as filled with the kind of potential. I mean, that list that you guys have of collaborators is not only long, but it's beginning to show a lot of depth. There's not a lot of models like that in academia. Not in the United States. There, in certain pockets, yes. In the Pacific Northwest, and I think Bill Freeman can talk to that. Where you have robust Native communities and certain institutions, yeah, but not generally. In a place like New Zealand and Hawaii, yes, but that's because of the sort of status of indigenous political struggles and things like treaty rights that require universities to actually have to change how they think about their structures, including their legal obligations. You know, that's a condition that gives someone like, makes it possible to have someone like Linda Tuhiwai-Smith and Maori researchers kind of play a role of like a leadership role in the struggle to develop research that is accountable to Native people in the fullest of ways.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to just to say we are at time. I think this is a great conversation, and the next session doesn't start until 10:30. So if we want to continue, I'm open to that. Does anybody, Crystal, do you have more time to spend here? I see Lori has a question, so.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
It's not really a question, but it's more of me thinking out loud because I'm trying something new. For those of you that know me, know that it's really hard for me to sit back and keep my mouth shut. And so in this presentation today, I wanted to listen and really hear, not just with my ears, but also with my heart, the message that Crystal has and is carrying forth on behalf of this coalition of folks that she presents. And I'm sharing this quite honestly and truthfully because when Misty and Tad reached out to Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe about getting a response to participating in this project, Tad very honestly emailed me and our district representative, Leroy Fairbanks, and said, Misty, if you want to get a hold of anybody at Leech Lake and get a response, please contact Lori and Leroy. They're really good at responding. And I had no idea what this project was about. So I took it and I emailed it out to our Division of Resource Management, our Health Division, our Human Services Department, and our DIPO as well. And oh my God, I shared with Tad and Misty and Ann and Adriana that after that email correspondence, I literally was pulling the arrows out of the back of my shirt. And, you know, Vincent, you're right. Doing research within our own communities is really oftentimes difficult. And Crystal, what I wanted to ask or remind you of is that part of this project, this truth project, is about reconciliation. And within my family, wild rice is so huge. It's such a learning tool within it, like multi-generational learning tool. Like we learned from our grandfathers and our grandmothers, and we have stories going back from when my grandmother would, on my dad's side, would go back to Boys Fort and spend time with her sisters and how they did things differently on the lakes up there that they raced than what they did here at Leech Lake. And then growing up and raising my children, one who's a Mille Lacs Laker, and introducing him to the ways that they rice at Mille Lacs and on specific lakes. As my dad and my grandpa would laughingly say, they do it backwards there. And as our relatives at Mille Lacs tell us, you guys are backwards up there at Leech Lake and White Earth for the way you rice. You know, but understanding that and that part of the reconciliation piece, what I heard and with your presentation was that understanding and that reckoning of being in the field of academia and understanding the harm that you were causing unintentionally by continuing with your research. And I share that because my brother works for the DRM. I love him dearly. He's my way older brother, okay? 4 years older than me, and we tease each other about that. And in our community, he is an elder. And he is somebody that people do go to for various teachings around our lakes and our waters and our ceremonies. And to have him come at me in such an ugly fashion when I was just being the message carrier was really hurtful to me. And I called him out on it in a personal conversation, right? Like, why would you do that in such a professional setting? Why would you do that to me? I'm your sister, right? And we had this conversation about wild rice and our lake systems. And Mike, I listened to you speak yesterday as well. And we started talking about how our grandfathers were raised on the lakes here. And the introduction of the all of it. My grandpa said when he was a little boy, one day he woke up and came out of his own grandfather's place, and they didn't know the lay of the lakes and the river, and that was due to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer and messing with the lake levels, right? The water levels. And then talking with Ben, our current interim DRM director, he was very outspoken about just tell the University of Minnesota to quit researching our wild rice and leave us alone. And so I talk about that because that reconciliation doesn't just stop because you've got these partners with other tribes, right? Like it's that continual and ongoing work at relationships, and not this what can I say? Not this backhanded way of them shooting the messenger to carry the message on to the University of Minnesota, right? And as I looked at your list, I saw that Rich Robinson, who is out on leave, our DRM director signed on, but I also know from our internal documents here at Leech Lake was that Leech Lake took a very strong stance against supporting this research, right? But here's our DRM director on there. And so now it tells me, okay, I'm seeing all of this and hearing all of this, and I will strongly urge you to reach out to a navigator of our community to help begin those conversations again. I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, and working with tribal communities is never easy, especially when there's years and years and years and decades of harm that has occurred, and we see history repeating itself, right? Like you brought it up in your presentation that the tribes just learned in the last couple of months in 2021 that the University of Minnesota, and it looked like from your research, and it seems like somebody brought up the year yesterday was 2016 or somewhere between 2016 and 2018 that the research at the University of Minnesota began again. But nobody knows for sure. Like nobody can come out or will come out and say, this is when the University of Minnesota approached the Minnesota State Legislature for more funding. This is the department that approached it with support from the Minnesota Wild Rice Growers Association, right? And those are parts of the reconciliation that we need. Like, just admit that this happened and we can move forward from there, right? But it's great hearing your presentation. I don't represent the DRM, but I have been assigned to be this research fellow for Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. And I still haven't decided, just based upon like the reaction of my own community members, where my focus on this research is going to be. So thank you for your presentation today. As Adriana said earlier, it's so very, very rare to hear that ownership in these spaces. And I really appreciate that, Miigwech.
I think you're absolutely right. I just wanted to say that, you know, like for me as TIPO, your research in terms of like, this is how much calcium, or, you know, these are the things that with climate change and everything else, this is what would make for the best environment for wild rice from our research. Like, this is what we've found. So when you're reviewing a project, whether it's a mine or timber cutting somewhere or something from the USDA, these are things to keep in mind. These are things to put into your request when you respond back to the agency. Something like that would be a huge help, but it doesn't need to, in order to do that research, you don't need to get into the deeper, you don't have to record like all the spiritual significance of the rice. The people know that already. The university hasn't proven, to me at least, especially if it's still doing this research, that it's deserving enough to keep those stories too, especially if it's just going to share it, publish it, people are going to profit off of it. You know, like, you all don't need that. But if the goal is really to help that rice and help and work in a good way with different communities, having that knowledge for a tribe to be able to say and work with their own scientists, their own DNR folks, and just be able to say, you know, this is our position on what the rice needs. And so you can use that to interpret all these Section 106 requests. That's helpful, you know. Finding ways to be able to connect kids and science and rice and that responsibility of being a good relative to that rice, that's helpful. But it would require a really strong commitment, I think, from the university that mirrors what you're trying to do. So it's not okay if one group of researchers at the university can completely disregard all the work that, you know, we've all engaged in and you've all engaged in. The university, if they really are sincere about this, if this truth project is not just a checkbox kind of situation, then they need to commit to an across the board way of doing research. And I agree that, you know, in tribal governments, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on, and, you know, within that too, you know, and we have to be honest about that too. But there's a way to be able to protect that knowledge, and there's a way to be able to make sure that those intellectual property rights aren't just handed off to whoever has a doctorate, you know, and whoever received the grant. You know, there's a community relationship there. And a lot of us, you know, we are dealing with these conversations. Like, a lot of people are asking me, like, why are we doing this? What is up with this truth project? What is the point of this? Like, why, you know, why? And like, why are we going to put all these hours in? And what's the result? Like, what is going to be the outcome of this? And if it could be something across the board where other researchers are following at least the set of standards that you've established, that's a start, you know, but the university has to commit to that. And I strongly suggest consulting with other attorneys that have specialization in getting stuff done like this, like tackling really difficult challenges between tribal sovereignty and academic freedom. And really, tribal sovereignty trumps academic freedom, because we're talking about the sovereignty of a nation. We're talking about treaties with the federal government, and, you know, a state university doesn't get to dictate and you know, set priorities above that, or disregard that, or selectively apply that. But yeah, this is good conversation.
It's a great conversation. Thank you, everybody, for engaging in this discussion. I think, Crystal, obviously your presentation was, you know, really enriching. I know I learned a lot, and I'll post your materials, and I'll continue to, you'll probably hear back from me because I have like just so many questions for you. And this conversation around Manoomin will continue tomorrow. Manoomin and research will continue tomorrow at 1 p.m. Thursday. So I am going to stop the recording on this. And since it's 10:30 already, I think we will go ahead and introduce our next presenter.